So far we've been looking at various introductory thoughts about the book of Revelation. Who wrote it, when was it written, and how has it been generally understood. What I want to think about now is another aspect of the how, which is the question of how should we read the book of Revelation. Now this is quite complex and I'm struggling a little bit to make sure that I present it in a fairly coherent and comprehensible fashion. So this will be split over several videos and I want to focus on one particular thing at the moment. But let's introduce that. So let's have a look at how should we read the book of Revelation. I want to begin really by thinking about a particular passage, using a passage from Revelation as a sort of sample that we can build our understanding of the answer to this question of how should we read the book of Revelation. So I want us to look at Revelation 1 verses 12 to 13. And I picked this just as a fairly simple example that I can use. So in that passage we see that John writes, "Then I turned to see the voice that spoke with me, and having turned I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the 7 lampstands one like the Son of Man," who is very clearly Jesus as it unfolds. And I want us to focus really on these lampstands, these 7 golden lampstands. And to start by saying that there are kind of 2 questions that sound as if they're more or less the same, but there's a subtle and important difference. So we might ask that question with this question first of all: what is Jesus saying? What is John saying here? And that's specific to the passage. In other words, how do I understand this verse, this reference, this situation? So that's specific. And it's known as exegesis. It's getting out from that passage the specific meaning of that passage. Now, the meaning of the golden lampstands is actually fairly straightforward, because Jesus actually tells us a few verses on what the answer is. The mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands. 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands which you saw are the 7 churches. Now actually, the angels of the 7 churches pose a particular problem, or a conundrum for us. But the lampstands are fairly clear. It's the 7 churches. And you are probably aware that in chapters 2 and 3, he goes on to address each of those 7 churches, to talk about their strengths and their weaknesses. So that's pretty clear. We now know what those golden lampstands are. But I want you to imagine that you didn't have that interpretation from Jesus. How would we understand the lampstands? Because that's the situation we do find ourselves in with the rest of Revelation. It's almost like this is a kind of example, and we're given a clue on this one, but to help us to understand. So we had the first question, which is what was John saying here, but the second question is, how do I go about understanding? What are the principles that I should apply when I'm seeking to understand any book in the Bible, really? A lot of the principles that I want us to look at here apply generally, but Revelation has its specific challenges as well. So this is, if you like, a general thing. It's about principles, and it's known as hermeneutics. So what we really want to be looking at is not, at this stage, the exegesis, what is happening in this particular verse, but the general, how do I go about understanding? So we are going to look at these principles of interpretation. And I need to give you there is a little bit of history behind how we go about understanding these principles of interpretation, the hermeneutics. Systematic hermeneutics actually began with the Reformation. And its purpose was very simple: to discover the author's original meaning. And I think that's still what we are interested in, what we're after. But as time has gone on, hermeneutics has spread to other disciplines, and notably to philosophy. It's not surprising. Apparently, according to one person that I was listening to, it really started with law, because like the study of scriptures, law is all about, if you like, key documents. They don't quite have the status that the Bible has, but they're pretty close. So you have to ask this question, well, you know, when those laws were put down, what do they mean? What do they mean then? What do they mean now? Which is exactly the same as the sort of questions we have to ask about the scriptures. But then it spread to other areas of study, and in particular philosophy. And as you can imagine, as philosophy has developed and become increasingly subjective, so has the understanding of hermeneutics. And so over the centuries, really, the understanding of hermeneutics has become more consumer oriented. And so it's become almost not so much what did it mean to the writer? What was the writer trying to say? But increasingly it's become what does it mean to me? You can also compare that with art. You know, there's been this transition from the artist capturing the world around him, trying to understand and explain key things about my understanding of the world, both physical and spiritual, to how do I feel? What does it mean for me? Now, interestingly enough, there has been a current trend, I've said tend, but the current trend has been in a slightly more objective direction, but it marries the two. And now the recognition is that we are interested in what the writer is saying, but that we bring something to the party. And I'll be saying that a little bit more about that later on. But I think within the Christian context in particular, we still emphasize the author. What is the author saying? What was the purpose of what was written? What was he saying to the original people? And as a consequence, what's he saying to us? There is some value in this kind of more subjective element of modern hermeneutics, because in a sense there are two levels even of hermeneutics, or certainly two levels of interpretation. There is, if you like, the fundamental understanding, all right, what is the writer saying? But once you understood that, you then have to say, okay, what does this mean to me? So that subjective element is still there. And you recognize that although there may be, one assumes that there is pretty much a single reason, a single thing that the writer is saying, although sometimes it can be a bit more complex than that, there are multiple interpretations, multiple applications, I should say. So that one reality, that one truth, may genuinely apply in a whole variety of ways to different individuals. So we return to the question, how should we read the book of Revelation? And I want to introduce as the first and fundamental principle, context. Context is vital. Context is not the whole story, but it is a very key part of how we understand any writing or any message. And so I've not made it context, I've made it context, context, context. We need to understand the context. Now, in the light of this, I want to introduce you to a chart that in various forms is actually fairly well known, and I think it forms an understanding of how we should read the Bible, read any book of the Bible in context. And you can see there's this kind of, it's almost like dropping a stone into a pond, and you can get these ripples going out. So when we look at the lampstand, for example, you start with this word lampstand and you say, how do I understand the word? What does the word mean? How does the word fit the immediate context? which is really the word within the sentence and even the paragraph. How does the immediate context fit into the flow of logic? I've given the lampstand. You might then look at, well, we're going to read this, we're going to look at the lampstand in a minute, so I'll kind of fill in the gaps on these ideas. And then you might go further. How does this all fit with the author's stated or implied purpose? So you're into the book. How does it fit within the book as a whole? And then you look even broader at the authors, if you've got other writings by the author, in this case perhaps John's Gospel and the writings of John. How do you understand your context? How do you understand what's being said fitting within the context of the author's general theology and general understanding? And in particular, has he used this word somewhere else? And does that give us insight? And in this case, even if it's not the Apostle John that's writing, but this John the Elder or someone else, he's still clearly part of the school of thought. He's certainly writing in a similar way to the John's Gospel. So it's still valid to say, well, let's look at that first. And then you broaden it out to the rest of the New Testament, and then to the rest of the Bible. It's written this way, Testament and Bible, because this still applies to Old Testament books as well, in which case you might look at the Old Testament first and then in fact look at the New Testament and how it's been used. So slight variations depending on which book you're looking at. But for Revelation, you'd look at the immediate context, the wider context, the book as a whole, John's writings, the New Testament, and then the Bible as a whole. Okay? But it doesn't stop there. But let's look at their context of example first. So we've got the word luchnia, and of course I'd look it up in the dictionary. So one of the classic dictionaries is the Greek English lexicon of the New Testament. It's based on an original work by Walter Bauer, but it's the most recent version. It was edited by Danker, so I'm calling it Danker. And he says that the word luchnia means lampstand. Well, not surprising, that's what NIV has translated it. A stand on which lamps were placed or hung. And he also says it's definitely not a candlestick. So you can't think of it as a sort of, a large pole with a candle stuck on the top. It would be something that you would put oil lamps on. They're effectively bowls of oil with some kind of wick, perhaps, or you might hang them from it. So let's look at the sentence. Well, in the sentence, doesn't give me anything more to hang it on. But when I look at the wider context, the paragraph, that's when I see that Jesus explains it in verse 20. So the context gives me everything. But have I got everything? Okay, so it means the churches. But why are they called lampstands? So I look a little bit broader. I look at the book and I find, it actually occurs again in chapter 2, verses 1 and 5, which is one of the letters to the churches, where Jesus says that he is the one that stands amongst the lampstands. And he warns them that if they don't mend their ways, he will remove them, remove the lampstand. So that's significant in that it obviously relates to the character of the church, the quality of the faith of the church. And then, in fact, a little bit later in the book, in chapter 11, we find there are two witnesses, and they're called lampstands. So we need to investigate that, to look at that. I'm not trying to actually come to a conclusion, so I won't go into, if you like, well, I think that means that's the exegesis. But certainly, we would put all this together, and this is the principle of putting the ideas together wherever they occur throughout the book. Now, in fact, when we look at the rest of John's writings, as we said we would, we find that it's not used anywhere else in John. But, interestingly enough, it is used in the other Gospels. And we get that well-known, I'm not sure if parable is the right word for it, but this statement of Jesus, that you don't hide your light, you put it on a lampstand. So Jesus makes it quite clear, if you like, at the heart of the Christian gospel, there is this idea that your faith, your commitment to God and to Christ is something that should be visible, something that should be so visible that it's promoted, as it were. You want to illuminate the whole area. That's the purpose of a lampstand. It is, in fact, used in Hebrews 9:2. And again, you'd look at that and get some value from that. You might even want to go further and you look at the Old Testament, and there's quite a lot of places where it's referred to, but in particular, of course, within the temple. Within the temple. And as I mentioned, Exodus chapter 25 describes the lampstand and how it's to be created for the tabernacle. And there are quite a lot of other passages. Most of them are simply saying that when you do it, you make sure you put the lampstand in place, or you take the lampstand down, or you protect the lampstand. But, you know, with some of those, there may well be some insights. But given that John actually does go back to the Old Testament quite a lot and builds a lot of what he says on Old Testament practices, this use of the lampstand in Exodus could be quite significant, and the fact that it is a key part of the temple. We belong within a temple. So I'm getting into exegesis now. I've got to be careful about that. But see the process, see the principle at work of looking at the context, and this ripple out from the context. Okay. I've got two quite important observations that I add on to that. It's really extending the concept of the context, because the context doesn't finish with the Bible. We might think it does. You know, I'm a man of the Bible and only the Bible. Well, certainly John in Revelation, it's a good example of how that's not entirely true, because John sometimes extends his context, his understanding beyond the Bible, to other works, and in particular to apocryphal books. Now, I've said respected apocryphal books. There are some apocryphal books that are really late and very questionable. But there were books also that were highly regarded, perhaps even discussed as whether they should be included in the Bible. And in particular, one good example here is from 1 Maccabees, which says they burned incense on the altar and lit the lamps on the lampstand, and there was light in the temple. Now, in a sense, it doesn't tell us anything we don't see in Exodus. This, in fact, refers to the period where the Jewish nation had actually regained their independence from the Persian kings. You would need to look at it in context to understand the whole, but you know, it's got its value. It may add a little something to the significance that we see in Revelation. But certainly John is not shy of using references to books that we would consider are not part of the Bible, New or Old Testament. Fundamentally, most of his references are in biblical books, but he will use references to others, and even to other apocalyptic writings. In particular, there's a few references to the Book of Enoch. So we need a wider context. We need to understand that wider context. And that goes further. We need to understand other non-biblical contexts, such as history. And I'll mention an example of that later on, or geography. Sometimes we need to know where things are, how they fit together. A simple example of that, of course, is that when John wrote to the 7 churches, one of the things that became apparent a long time ago, but it's not immediately obvious, is that he actually addresses the churches in a particular sequence, and they are the sequence in which someone with a letter would deliver the letter. It probably doesn't really add any great value to our understanding, but it's interesting, and certainly is part of the veracity of the fact that they are letters. You know, if they were simply a device that John was using to get some information across, he wouldn't be bothered perhaps about, you know, where they were, why, how you would do them, why would you put them in this particular order. Well, we know why they're in that particular order, because that's the order in which they would have been delivered. And society and customs. And we need to know these, because although we might not value them, they were there. They were part of John's understanding. If you like, part of trying to understand what John meant, what John was saying, is that we have to understand John himself and what he would take for granted. We would do the same if we were writing a letter. You wouldn't be thinking about the history of your country or the culture in which you live, but it would be part of your instinct, and you would use language in a particular way that that language requires. So grammar and language are also part of it. We might even study, for example, the Qumran community's use of apocalyptic literature as well, although I'm not sure how relevant that is to what I want to say. So what I'm saying here now is not the specifics, and we will touch on one or two of those as we go on. But again, that context is a big thing. Now, there is a question here, and that is, do I need to understand all this? Do I have to have this incredible understanding of the world of John's time, the culture, the history, all the Old Testament, all these apocalyptic books and apocryphal books? Isn't this making the gospel and the Christian message something for academics and specialists? And I want to be honest about this. The answer is both yes and no. In one sense, there is a task, a demand in understanding what's being said and being done. It's not absolutely simple and straightforward. And that's why we have the privilege of commentaries as well as translations, so that when we read our Bible in translation, when we look at a commentary to try and understand it, people have done that work, a lot of that work for us. But the answer is no as well, because, yeah, in order to understand, if you like, the niceties, the nuances, the extras, we need more understanding. But the great thing about the message of the New Testament is, if you like, the things that are important, the things that will give us life, are clear and evident. And in a way, one of the things I'd want to say, even about the book of Revelation, this is something I may touch on later, the fundamental message is actually pretty much on the surface, easy to see and clear. It's only when you start asking the more awkward questions, and indeed when we start asking, well, what does this actually mean? What are we saying here? That it perhaps becomes more demanding. But the fundamental message that John wants to give is that Jesus is king. And even through persecution, even though it looks as if we're losing, we're not. The king is king. The kingdom is coming, and he will conquer. So, we've got part of this two important extra observations is that the context doesn't end, therefore, with the Bible. As we've seen, it needs the whole context. But also context moves in both directions. So I've drawn this little diagram here. To some extent, this image that I've used is one that's very popular, but it's really formed on the basis that, you know, I'm reading this passage, I've got this word here, like we did with lampstand. I want to understand what it means. So you start with lampstand and you kind of filter out and get a bigger, you get an increasing understanding of what it means. But there's much about the Bible, and especially when we orientate ourselves in the first place, where, if you like, we come from that wider context and we narrow down on the particular word or the particular idea that's being expressed. Now, we shouldn't be surprised by this. This sounds almost as if I'm bringing stuff into the Bible. But we shouldn't be surprised by this. I actually said when I started, I read the dictionary, I got the dictionary meaning of the word. Well, where does the dictionary meaning come from? The dictionary meaning comes from the work that Danker and Bauer have done in reading that word throughout the Bible and coming to an understanding of how it's used, and indeed how it's used in Greek culture generally. So we've already used the wider context just by getting the meaning of the word. But let me take another example. I'm going to take as an example a passage from Revelation 3, well known, and you possibly even know what I'm going to be telling you about it. But this is in fact in the church of Laodicea, and Jesus says to them, I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either one or the other. So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. Now, does this mean that I'm going to be looking at how people have used this another time? I want to come back to this one. But the obvious thing that we read it when we look at this is it sounds as if God almost prefers people who reject him. He clearly wants people to be hot for him, but he also appreciates people that are cold, rejecting him. You're either hot or cold. What he doesn't want is people that neither one thing nor the other. Well, is that what it's saying? Is that what the passage is saying? The problem is we bring with us our perceptions and our understandings, and we already have this kind of contrast of hot or cold. But if we get to understand the context, the culture, we find the story is slightly different. Laodicea imported its water from Hierapolis. Okay, that's for the hot water, because they had these hot spas. And it imported it from Colossae, which had cold springs. But of course, both of them are coming a distance using, the typical Roman technology of aqueducts and so on. So by the time it got to Laodicea, the cold water was not quite so cold, and the hot water was not quite so hot. So it was kind of almost a hallmark of Laodicea that in all their uses of water, they were never quite desirable. And in particular, to drinking that water from Colossae, it was lukewarm. And maybe calling it horrible is going to an extreme. But, you would have preferred that water to be cold. And Jesus is using this in an extreme image. So hot water was actually desirable. It was positive. It was of use. Cold water was actually desirable, and it was of use. But the kind of water that you got in Laodicea was really not fit for purpose. And that's what's behind that image. So hot or cold were good for God. It's this lukewarmness that is just not fit for purpose. So I've kind of gone into a little bit into the exegesis of that passage, and one might have to read around that a bit more to confirm that what I've said is correct. I'm very wary of making too definitive a statement at this stage. But the important point there is that I bring the context, if you like. In this case, it's the geographical and cultural context, and even historical context, that I need to have in order to understand the passage in the first place. And if I don't, I will misread it. Now, not terribly badly, but the danger is that I will misread that passage and I will give it a false interpretation. So, I want to look at these problems that we have when using the wider context, and I'll pick up on that passage in Revelation 3. The main point of hermeneutics then is to understand the writer's meaning. But whenever we interpret another message, we have to bring some understanding. Now, that sounds as if it's me inserting information. Let me try and give you a sort of parallel that I hope will make it clear what I mean.
I am told that the last 3 speakers here have been the Pope, Her Majesty the Queen, and Nelson Mandela, which is either a very high bar or the beginning of a very funny joke.
Did you understand what Barack Obama was saying? Did you understand why everyone was laughing? Now, if you did, it's because you have already encountered the kind of joke he's talking about. Often there'd be, an Englishman, Irishman, Scotsman, or a Russian, American, and someone else. But, you start with this picture of important characters or important personages, and then something funny happens. And the people that were there obviously understood what Barack Obama said in the context of their appreciation of jokes. Now, they brought that understanding to Barack Obama's talk. Now, Barack Obama expected them to have that understanding as well. Let's look at it again, a similar sort of story, really, and hopefully bringing out the same principle.
Which makes me think of a story. Everything makes me think of a story. About 3 dogs, an American dog and a Polish dog and a Russian dog. They were all having a visit, and the American dog was telling them about how things were in this country. He said, you bark, and you bark long enough, and then somebody comes along and gives you some meat. And the Polish dog said, what's meat? The Russian dog says, what's bark?
Now, there again, same kind of basis. You've got one of these jokes. In this case, American, Russian, and Polish dogs. And obviously, we're meant to kind of associate dogs with human experience. And again, if you didn't find that funny, notice that people laughed and even clapped at the end. He said that the Polish dog said, what's bark? The Russian dog said, what's meat? The Russian dog said, what's bark? Now, if you didn't understand the context and the culture in the Cold War period, and at least the perception of Americans that Russians were controlled, that's really what the joke is all about. Now, whether it's true, I'm not trying to argue that they were or not, but the perception was that they were controlled. And therefore, the analogy, if you like, between the dog barking and as a result someone giving him food, the Russian dog isn't allowed to bark. He is controlled. And there's the joke. But you would need to come with that understanding in order to find that joke funny. You would also need to believe that it's true to a degree to find that joke funny. So when we come with some degree of understanding. And John will have written assuming that degree of understanding. That's the important thing. If we don't have that understanding, then we will miss the point. So if we go back to that passage that we had, remember I was saying we would come thinking hot and cold means either for or against, strongly for or strongly against. And actually, if you look at the history of and the culture of that time, that wasn't true. Both hot and cold were positive, whereas the lukewarm was the thing you didn't like. Now, I looked at lots of commentaries and they all said more or less the same thing. It was difficult to get a quote that kind of was quotable. I've got one from Moses Stewart, who was a great commentary. Really quite like the commentary from Moses Stewart. But it's a good example here of how you bring your understanding to the passage, and in this case wrongly. Cold would imply a state absolutely unchristian. Hot here means a fervid and zealous state. That's exactly how we assume it's meant. The imagery is intensely strong and denotes high disgust at the state of indifference in which the Laodicean church were. That was actually a correct, in my opinion, that was a correct conclusion. So fortunately he came to the correct conclusion, even though coming with a wrong understanding of hot or cold. But in other contexts, that assumption that you bring could well lead you to misunderstand what's being said. And so we have to ask questions about what we bring as well as what we get from the passage. So one of the questions I have to ask is, what do I think I know? Now, there are two types of things that I bring. I bring, if you like, the positives and negatives in a way, but I bring presuppositions, prior beliefs, many of which we don't even realize that we have. The contemporary images, hot and cold, are imposed on the passage. What is right and what is wrong? What is acceptable? One example, for example, is in a lot of passages in the Bible, the response to bad news and bad situations is that they rend their garments, they tear their clothes. What are we to make of that? That's not something we would do. And if we're not ready for that, if we don't understand the culture, the context, we might read all sorts of things into it that aren't there. Okay, so presuppositions. We also come with assumptions. And I guess assumptions, I'm differentiating assumptions from presuppositions in that assumptions we deliberately come with. They're beliefs before we start, we know we bring. So, for example, a good example is most Christians will come with a specific view of the Bible. I've put it generally because that's true of all Christians. For biblical-based Christians, it will be that the Bible is the inspired word of God, that it doesn't contradict itself, and therefore we would look at resolutions of apparent conflicts when we read it. There will be some Christians who don't have quite such a high view of the Bible and may come with something slightly different, but they will still have a view of the Bible and they will still expect biblical works to fit within that view. But there are plenty of other assumptions that we might bring as well. And I'd like to make sort of a personal comment on this. That the first is that we should question our assumptions. We should start the journey, if you like, by not assuming too much. Do I believe that the Bible is inspired because I have been taught that it's inspired? Or do I believe that the Bible is inspired because I have already read the Bible, interpreted the Bible, and come to that conclusion? Now, if it's the first, I think there's danger. If it's the second, then I think that's perfectly valid, because there's also a cyclical nature to our understanding of any text. And, you know, when we read a text and we get some information out of it, we don't come back the next time as if we've never read it. So we're going to come back with assumptions that are built by our understanding of the text itself. It's cyclical. So to come to the Bible, to recognize that God speaks to me through the Bible, to recognize that the Bible is in some sense inspired, and the nature of that inspiration is something that I derive and develop as I read the Bible. And if I come to the Bible and see contradictions and complexities, then I've got to take that seriously as well. Now, that's not to say that I don't get teaching from the church, that I don't talk to other people, that I don't hone my understanding through what other people say. It would be silly of me to think that I have to get the whole understanding on my own. And so I may well gain an understanding from my reading of the Bible, take it away, and then find that that's challenged by my interaction with other believers. That's perfectly valid too. But the general principle applies that, the Bible should determine my understanding, not my understanding determine the Bible. So what do I think I know? I come with assumptions, things that I know that I bring to the Bible and I expect to find in the Bible. I need to allow those assumptions to be challenged. But it's not a wrong thing to do that. But I need to be aware that I also come with presuppositions, and I need to challenge those. I need to be careful about those. And this is difficult because I won't even know that I'm applying presuppositions half the time. And so that leaves me with not only what do I think I know, but what don't I know? And if I read a text without context, I will probably miss key pieces of information. We've already really covered this. And so, as I've already said, that includes non-biblical context of history, geography, society, and grammar and language. All of those things are part of that. Let me give you one more example. In Sardis, we are told, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what time I will come to you. Now, Sardis, geographically, is known as having a sort of acropolis, an area that people could retreat to when they're under attack. And it's impenetrable. An impenetrable upper fortress on an acropolis, a bit like Athens. Except there was a little back door, a little route in and out, which the people in Sardis actually used. Now, it was very difficult to find, it was hidden, and it was incredibly useful because obviously they could sneak resources in and out, food, water, when they were under siege by enemies. They were once attacked by the Persians, and the general was an extremely intelligent general, and he actually made a point of watching and learning, and he saw people using this back door. He actually worked out that there was a back door, and he actually sent a select troop through that back door and actually managed to get into this fortress, to open the doors and allow the troops in, and they conquered what was apparently an impenetrable fortress. And it was a total shock. He did it at a time and in a way that they weren't expecting, like a thief. So the perception is that Jesus may well be referring back to that experience of Sardis. It was a well-known part of history for them. So he's saying, rather like the Persians did, there was some suggestion that the Seleucids did something similar. I will come like a thief. So I will come like those troops. Now, again, it doesn't really tell us very much that's not clear in the passage, but it gives a little bit of dynamism to the verse, understanding the context. So context is all important. It isn't the whole story, and in the next video we will look at some of the other elements of hermeneutics that we will need to bring to the process of interpreting Revelation and the Bible generally. But I hope I've convinced you that the overall context is vital, and this context is something we derive from what we're looking at. We start with a word and spread out like a stone dropped in the pond, But sometimes we also come and bring the wider context and then narrow in on the thing that we're looking at as well. We need that context. And it's an art, not a science. And it's demanding, but it's so life-building when it gives us insights that we might not otherwise have had.